Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so you've got this stack of research on the 1980s, and we want to tackle this question, was really the Hispanic Decade. It's a fascinating time period. Seems like a lot of contradictions.
It wasn't a simple win.
Yeah, major steps forward for Hispanic-Americans,
Right.
but also some pushback.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into this and see what we can uncover.
To really understand the 1980s, you have to start with just the sheer population growth happening. The Hispanic population in the U.S. was booming, particularly in states like California, Texas, Florida.
Right. Those are in the articles.
Yeah, you'll recognize some of these.
And more people. I mean, you know what they say.
More voters.
More potential voters.
Exactly.
And that's where things get interesting.
Politicians can't ignore those numbers.
Yeah.
Between 1970 and 1992, we see the number of Hispanic representatives in Congress triple.
Wait, triple?
And the 80s were really a key part of that surge.
Wow. That's a massive change in just a couple of decades.
Yeah.
What caused that kind of shift?
Well, a few things converged.
Okay.
First, there were the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act,
Okay.
which introduced majority-minority districts.
Hmm.
It was a way to redraw district lines
Okay.
to give minority groups a better chance of electing representatives who truly reflected their interests.
Yeah, makes sense. Giving everyone a fair shake.
Right.
Having their voices heard.
Yeah, but this also gets into the whole issue of
I was going to say.
gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering.
Which is kind of a loaded term.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not always as straightforward as it sounds.
Right.
Drawing those lines to favor certain groups definitely boosted Hispanic representation in Congress.
Yeah.
But it also sparked some debate.
Okay.
Did it actually concentrate power in a way that could backfire in the long run? Was it a short-term win with potential long-term consequences?
Yeah.
Tough questions, and ones that still resonate today.
Right. And then at the same time, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the CHC,
Absolutely.
is also gaining more influence, right? They were starting to make waves on the national stage.
Yeah, the CHC brought together Hispanic members of Congress to push for policies important to their communities.
Okay.
We're talking immigration reform, bilingual education, protecting civil rights, all major issues that were front and center during this time.
Yeah, so we've got this growing political power.
Right.
A group dedicated to fighting for Hispanic interests. It sounds like the stage is set for some major legislation.
Yeah.
And sure enough, we get the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act.
Huge.
The IRCA.
The landmark moment.
This was a big one.
The IRCA was hugely impacting millions.
Okay.
Think about this.
Okay.
It granted amnesty to almost 2.7 million undocumented immigrants,
Wow.
most of whom were Hispanic.
Wow.
This allowed them to live openly, work legally, and contribute without fear of deportation.
Yeah, this is a life-changing event.
Talk about a life-changing...
For so many families.
Right.
And it didn't stop there.
It wasn't a simple solution.
The IRCA also tried to address some of the complexities of immigration in other ways.
You're right, it wasn't a simple solution.
Okay.
Alongside amnesty, there were provisions for increased border security and penalties for employers hiring undocumented workers.
Yeah.
This part was definitely controversial.
Right.
But the core focus was establishing a pathway to citizenship for those who gained legal status.
So not just letting people stay,
Right.
but actually giving them a shot at becoming full-fledged American citizens.
Exactly.
Yeah, this feels like a big step towards integrating Hispanic communities
Absolutely.
further into the fabric of American society.
It absolutely was.
Wow.
And we can't forget the role of powerful Hispanic lobbying groups, like the National Council of La Raza, NCLR, and the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF. Their relentless advocacy efforts were instrumental in getting this legislation passed.
Wow. So it seems like things were looking up for Hispanic Americans in the 80s. Major legal victories,
Right.
increased political representation, and organizations fighting tirelessly for their rights. Was it all smooth sailing from there?
Well, not quite.
I was wondering when we'd get to that part.
While there were these huge steps forward, there was also a rising tide of pushback against this progress.
Okay.
The 80s weren't just a victory lap. There were some serious challenges brewing as well.
what were some of the obstacles Hispanic communities faced during this time?
A lot of it stemmed from the social and political climate of the Reagan era.
Okay.
Reagan's conservative policies, while often discussed broadly, had specific and often difficult consequences for various groups, including Hispanic-Americans.
So we're talking about the impact of those policies on a community already grappling with rapid change and facing existing inequalities.
Exactly.
Okay.
One major area was cuts to social programs.
Correct.
Like welfare, education, and healthcare.
Correct.
These programs were a lifeline for many families, particularly within minority communities, where economic disparities were often more pronounced.
Right.
And with the Hispanic population booming, the impact of these cuts was deeply felt.
So it feels like a bit of a paradox. On one hand, you have Hispanic political representation growing, but on the other, policies are being implemented that make life harder for many within those same communities.
It was definitely a time of contradictions, and this wasn't the only challenge.
Okay.
Remember affirmative action?
Yeah.
Those policies designed to level the playing field for groups historically facing discrimination. Well, in the 80s, there was a growing backlash against these programs, with critics calling them reverse discrimination.
So even as certain doors were opening, others seemed to be closing, or at least becoming harder to push through.
Yes. And this brings us to something you probably have in your stack of sources. Proposition 187. While it wasn't passed until 1994, it really reflects the anti-immigrant sentiment brewing throughout the 80s. This proposition aimed to deny undocumented immigrants access to public services like education and healthcare.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Prop 187 caused a huge uproar with massive protests led by Hispanic organizations.
Absolutely.
It seems like even with all the advancements, the 1980s were still a time of intense struggle and activism for Hispanic communities.
There were hard-won victories, but also constant pushback. And woven through it all is this fascinatingly complex issue of gerrymandering, which we touched on earlier.
The whole majority-minority district.
Exactly. Some argued that while it created these pockets of political power, it also, in a way, isolated Hispanic voters, potentially limiting their influence on a broader scale. It's a question that lingered. Did gerrymandering ultimately help or hinder the pursuit of true equality? And it's something that continued to be debated, especially as the Supreme Court started scrutinizing race-based gerrymandering in the early 2000s.
It really makes you think how something intended to empower a community can have these complicated ripple effects down the line.
Absolutely.
So with all these different forces at play, legislative victories, social and political backlash, and complex political strategies, how do historians even begin to unpack the meaning of the Hispanic Decade?
That's where things get even more interesting. Historians have a variety of viewpoints on this era, each focusing on different aspects of the story. It's like piecing together a puzzle with different people suggesting how the pieces fit.
Now, you've got me intrigued. What are some of the different schools of thought out there?
Well, one perspective is what we might call the progressive view. They highlight the significant strides made during the 80s, pointing to legislation like the IRCA and the rise of activism as proof of real progress towards empowerment.
So for them, the Hispanic Decade label would be a pretty accurate reflection of what happened.
Yes, they'd likely argue that it was a period of genuine positive change. Then you have the social history perspective. They zoom in on the grassroots efforts and the energy of local activism that laid the foundation for the political gains we see. Their focus is on those individuals and community organizations working tirelessly on the ground to make a difference.
So it's about recognizing the power of people coming together to drive change from within. I like that.
But then you have the revisionist view, which takes a more critical look at the limitations of progress during this time. They point to persistent inequalities, think economic disparities, the vulnerability of affirmative action as evidence that The Hispanic Decade, while significant, didn't fulfill all its promises.
So a more nuanced view
exactly.
that acknowledges both the advancements and the work that remained to be done.
Exactly.
Okay.
And finally, there's the post-colonial perspective, which examines Hispanic struggles through the lens of U.S. imperialism and its legacy. They argue that even legislative wins often failed to address those deeper structural inequalities rooted in a history of colonialism and exploitation.
Wow, that adds another layer of complexity to the whole conversation.
Right.
It's fascinating how a single decade can be interpreted in so many different ways.
And that's the beauty of history.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing dates and events. It's about understanding the complexities and appreciating those different lenses through which we can view the past.
It feels like we've covered a lot of ground already. But I'm curious to dive even deeper into what life was actually like during this time.
Okay.
Is there a way to get a more personal perspective on what was happening?
You're thinking about primary sources.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some firsthand accounts and documents that can transport us back in time and give us a glimpse into the lived experiences of people during this period.
It's like stepping into a time machine and hearing those voices from the past, sharing their stories, struggles, and hopes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you're in luck, because in your research, you've actually got some amazing primary sources from this era.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these incredible primary sources right at our fingertips.
Yeah.
A direct line to the past. What kind of materials are we talking about here?
Well, you'll find this particularly interesting.
Okay.
Imagine reading through the actual legislative records from the debates surrounding the IRCA.
Wow.
Think about the passionate arguments for and against amnesty.
Okay.
The compromises that were made. It's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how this landmark legislation was shaped.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
It's like stepping right into those crucial moments of decision-making. What else have we got?
Well, consider this.
Okay.
The court decisions and legal documents
Okay.
around those 1982 Voting Rights Act amendments.
Okay.
You can trace the evolution of gerrymandering.
Right.
How it played out in practice and how it sparked those legal challenges that continue to this day.
Right.
It's a powerful reminder that even seemingly technical legal decisions have real-world consequences.
Those court cases. I remember seeing some references to them in the articles you sent over. It's amazing to think about those decisions shaping the political landscape for years to come.
Absolutely.
Wow.
But for me, the most compelling primary sources are the ones that give us a direct window into people's lives.
Right.
Imagine reading testimonies from members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, hearing firsthand about their experiences navigating the political system, the challenges they faced, and the strategies they used to fight for their communities.
It's like hearing those stories straight from the source.
Right.
The passion, the dedication, the frustrations and the triumphs.
Absolutely.
It really brings history to life in a way that textbooks just can't.
Totally.
Yeah.
These personal accounts add so much depth and texture to our understanding of the Hispanic Decade.
Right.
They remind us that we're not just talking about abstract concepts and political maneuvering.
Yeah.
We're talking about real people's lives.
So we've explored the political landscape, the legislative battles, and now we've got these incredible primary sources to provide that personal touch.
Right.
It really paints a multifaceted picture of the Hispanic Decade.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, with all this information, how do historians reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of this era?
It's a great question. And it's one that historians continue to grapple with. It's tempting to simplify the 1980s as a decade of either undeniable progress or insurmountable challenges.
Right.
But the reality is much more complex.
Yeah.
It was both simultaneously.
Yeah, it's like constant push and pull.
Exactly.
That we've been talking about.
It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
And then a sidestep just to keep things interesting.
Exactly.
Right. You have these monumental wins like the IRCA, which transformed the lives of millions.
Huge.
And then you have the cuts to social programs, the backlash against affirmative action, the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. It's a lot to process.
It's a lot.
Calling it the Hispanic Decade might oversimplify a very complicated reality.
I agree. The label is catchy, and it does highlight a period of significant change.
Right.
But it doesn't fully capture the nuances of what was happening. It's important to remember that history rarely fits neatly into these predetermined boxes.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
The 1980s didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a much larger historical continuum.
Exactly.
With events and trends spilling over from previous decades and shaping the decades that followed.
Exactly.
Right? We're talking about the 80s.
Yeah.
But Prop 187 didn't even happen until 1994.
Exactly.
And its roots can be traced back even further.
Right.
These social and political forces have momentum. They don't just disappear when the calendar flips over.
Right.
It's a great reminder that history is an ongoing conversation, not a collection of isolated events.
Absolutely.
So as we try to make sense of this complex and fascinating period, what are some of the key takeaways?
Okay.
What should our listeners who are already well-versed in this topic keep in mind as they continue their exploration?
Well, I think one crucial takeaway is that progress is rarely linear. The Hispanic Decade was a time of remarkable advancement, but it was also a period of significant struggle.
Right.
There were wins, but also setbacks.
Yeah.
Steps forward, but also steps back. And it's essential to recognize and acknowledge both.
It's about understanding that the pursuit of equality is a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
And even when there are major victories, the work is never truly finished.
Absolutely.
Right.
And another important takeaway is that history is always open to interpretation.
Yeah.
We've explored different historical perspectives on this era, and it's clear that there's no single definitive answer to the question of whether the 1980s truly deserve the label Hispanic Decade.
Right. It's more about understanding the different lenses through which we can view the past.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And appreciating the complexity of the historical narrative.
Exactly.
History isn't about memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about engaging in a critical and ongoing conversation with the past, grappling with its contradictions and drawing connections to our own lives and the world around us.
So for you, dear listener, as you delve deeper into those primary sources and continue exploring this era, what are some questions worth pondering?
Well, one question I always find myself returning to is, how do we measure progress?
Okay.
Is it solely about legislation passed? Or is it also about social and economic equality?
Right.
Access to education and health care and the ability to live free from discrimination?
Those are big questions that are still relevant today.
Absolutely.
Not just in the context of the 1980s, but in how we understand and address these issues in our own time.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's also crucial to think about whose voices are centered.
Okay.
When we tell the story of the Hispanic Decade, are we amplifying the experiences of those who benefited from these changes?
Right.
Are we also giving space to those who faced setbacks and challenges?
It's about recognizing the diversity of experiences within any historical period and ensuring that we're not creating a monolithic narrative that overlooks the nuances and complexities of the past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, I think it's important to ask how the Hispanic Decade reflects broader themes in American history, like immigration, identity, social justice, and the ongoing pursuit of equality for all.
It's about understanding that this period wasn't just about one group of people.
Right.
It was about a nation wrestling with its own identity and the role of diversity in shaping its future.
And that conversation continues today.
It does.
Which is why exploring this era is so relevant and thought-provoking.
Right.
It's not just about the past.
Yeah.
It's about understanding our present and shaping a more just and equitable future.
Well said.
Yeah.
And this whole conversation, it's really been about more than just policy changes and political representation. It's about the cultural shifts happening at the same time, right?
Absolutely.
The 1980s saw a surge in Hispanic art, music, and literature that really captured the spirit of the times.
It's impossible to separate those cultural expressions from the social and political movements we've been discussing.
Right.
Think about the rise of salsa music, for example.
Okay.
That fusion of Latin rhythms with jazz and other genres created this vibrant soundscape that reflected the changing demographics and cultural landscape of the U.S.
Right.
And it wasn't just confined to Hispanic communities. It crossed over, capturing the attention of a wider audience.
Yeah, it's like that cultural exchange added another layer to the whole integration process.
Absolutely.
I'm also thinking about the Chicano art movement,
right,
which really gained momentum in the 1980s.
That movement was all about using art as a tool for social change, expressing Chicano identity and challenging stereotypes.
Okay.
Those bold murals and thought-provoking artwork became a powerful way to raise awareness about issues like discrimination, social justice, and cultural pride.
And you actually included some articles about a few key figures from this movement.
Yeah.
I was especially drawn to the work of, mention a specific artist from the listeners' provided sources. It's amazing to see how they used their art to address those broader societal issues.
Absolutely. And literature played a crucial role in shaping the narrative as well.
Okay.
I bet you've heard of Sandra Cisneros' novel, The House on Mango Street.
Oh, yeah.
It was published in 1984.
I remember that one.
And quickly became a classic.
It's about a young Latina girl growing up in Chicago, right?
That's the one.
Okay.
It really resonated with readers because it captured those universal themes of coming of age, family, and finding your place in the world.
Yeah.
All while providing this intimate glimpse into the life of a young Chicano woman navigating her own identity and the challenges of her community.
It's like these different forms of expression.
Yeah.
Music, art, literature.
They all work together.
Yeah, they all work together to paint a more complete picture of the Hispanic Decade.
Absolutely.
Giving us a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the human experience during that time.
They really do. And what's fascinating is that this wasn't just a story about a single group's advancement.
Right.
The Hispanic Decade, with all its contradictions and triumphs, was a reflection of a nation grappling with its own evolving identity. It forced a conversation about what it meant to be American in a rapidly changing world.
And that conversation continues today.
It does.
It feels like we're still working through those same questions.
Right.
About diversity, inclusion, and equality in a society that's constantly evolving.
Absolutely. The echoes of the Hispanic Decade are still felt today.
Yeah.
Reminding us that progress requires constant vigilance and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Right.
It also reminds us that history is not just a collection of events in the past. It's a living, breathing entity.
Right.
That shapes who we are and the choices we make today.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
I
want to leave you with a few thoughts.
Okay.
Remember that the Hispanic Decade wasn't just about politics and policies. It was about culture, art, literature, and the countless individual stories of struggle and triumph.
And keep in mind that there's no single definitive answer to the question of whether it was truly the Hispanic Decade.
Right.
Embrace the different perspectives we've explored and continue to question, research, and engage in that ongoing conversation with the past.
So much great advice. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Hispanic Decade. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history.
Absolutely.
I hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we have. Keep exploring.
Yeah.
And until next time, keep those historical wheels turning.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.